In 2019, the money didn't disappear overnight. It trickled out of American bank accounts in $200, $500, $1,000 chunks. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that set off alarms. And that's exactly why it worked. People checked their balances and shrugged. No panic. No gut punch. Just a quiet transfer, followed by a calm confirmation screen. At first, it felt almost boring. No hype. No pressure. No flashy promises. Just a steady, slow-moving flow of money that looked normal. And every time someone hesitated, the same thought popped up. If this were dangerous, wouldn't something already look wrong? The numbers kept growing. Not fast enough to scare anyone. Not big enough to make headlines. Just enough to feel safe. Weeks passed. Then months. Statements arrived on time. Small returns showed up right when expected. The kind of thing you barely mention at dinner. But here's the part nobody questioned, and later couldn't stop thinking about. Why did everything feel so calm? Because behind the scenes, something else was happening. Something designed to stay invisible for as long as possible. This wasn't about rushing people. It was about waiting them out. The real danger wasn't losing money. It was forgetting you were risking anything at all. And by the time a few people finally felt that tight feeling in their chest, the kind that tells you something's off, the system had already moved past them. That's the first open loop. The second one is worse. Because when investigators eventually pulled the records, they realized the slow pace wasn't a side effect. It was the strategy. And the moment the money stopped moving was the moment everyone finally understood what they had been part of. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, thousands of people were already in. Not thrill seekers. Not gamblers. Regular Americans who thought they were being careful. Retirees trying to stretch savings. Middle-class families parking extra cash somewhere stable. First-time investors who were told this was the safe option. The risk wasn't obvious because it didn't feel like risk. No countdown timers. No pressure calls. No once-in-a-lifetime pitch. Just consistency. And that's what made the damage worse. Some people lost a few $1,000s. Others lost entire emergency funds. Money meant for rent, medical bills, college tuition. Money that was never supposed to be at risk in the first place. What's coming next in this story isn't about one bad decision. It's about how normal behavior, patience, trust, routine, was quietly used against people. Later, you'll see how warning signs were visible but emotionally invisible. Why the slow pace stopped victims from comparing notes. How paperwork that looked clean actually hid the biggest problem of all. And how the collapse didn't start with panic. It started with silence. Because when the system finally froze, it didn't explode. It just stopped responding. No alerts. No explanations. Just delays that stretched longer each week. And that's when people began asking questions they should have asked months earlier. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even if they had asked sooner, it probably wouldn't have mattered. Because this wasn't built to break fast. It was built to last long enough. Long enough to feel proven. Long enough to feel boring. Long enough to pull people in who would never touch anything risky. And that leads to the most important question of all. One that changes how this entire story looks. Where did this idea come from? And who realized that slow money was the perfect weapon? It didn't start as a bold plan. There was no master blueprint, no dramatic pitch written on a whiteboard. Just a simple observation that kept coming up again and again. People weren't scared of losing money. They were scared of looking stupid. Flashy schemes failed fast because they triggered ego. Big promises made people defensive. But slow, reasonable opportunities? Those slipped past the guardrails. The seed of the idea formed around that insight. If something felt boring, people trusted it more. If the numbers were small, people didn't scrutinize them. If nothing urgent was happening, no one felt the need to double-check. On paper, the concept made sense. Instead of promising high returns, the system would promise stability. Instead of fast growth, it would emphasize consistency. Instead of aggressive marketing, it would rely on calm language and quiet referrals. That was the first retention trigger: contradiction. On the surface, this looked like the opposite of every scam people had been warned about. And that was exactly the point. The early structure wasn't complicated. Small deposits, predictable schedules, clear-looking documentation. Nothing that screamed danger. In fact, parts of it mirrored legitimate financial tools people already used. That familiarity wasn't accidental. It reduced friction. It made participation feel like a routine decision instead of a risky one. At the time, even skeptics could justify it. Start small. Watch how it performs. Pull out if anything feels off. That logic felt responsible. It felt adult. What no one considered yet was how time would do the heavy lifting. Weeks passed with no issues. Then months. Each successful cycle reinforced the same thought. If there were a problem, it would have shown up by now. That belief slowly replaced vigilance. Here's the second retention trigger: foreshadowing. That assumption would later become the most expensive mistake of all. Because the system wasn't designed to fail under pressure. It was designed to avoid pressure entirely. The longer it ran without incident, the stronger it became. Not financially, psychologically. People didn't just trust the system. They trusted their own judgment for trusting it. And once that happened, something subtle changed. The question stopped being, "Is this safe?" It became, "Why wouldn't this be safe?" That's when the seed fully took root. Not through deception. Through reassurance. Not by forcing belief. By letting people convince themselves. And buried inside that calm, reasonable logic was a flaw so basic that almost no one noticed it. Because if the system never needed to prove where the money came from, what would happen when someone finally asked where it was actually going? That question wouldn't get answered for a long time. The first confirmations came quietly. Not in headlines. Not in group chats blowing up. Just small notifications that popped up and disappeared like any other routine alert. A balance updated. A transfer cleared. A withdrawal landed exactly when it was supposed to. That was all it took. The amounts were modest, almost forgettable. Enough to feel reassuring, not enough to celebrate. And because nothing dramatic happened, people assumed that meant everything was working. This is where the partial truths started doing the heavy lifting. Yes, money was moving. Yes, payouts were real. Yes, the system did exactly what it said it would, at least on the surface. And that surface-level accuracy became its strongest defense. People began sharing their experiences the same way they share a good utility tip. Low energy. No excitement. Just calm confirmation. Mine cleared too. Same here. No issues so far. That was the social proof. Not hype. Consensus. When doubts came up, they didn't get argued down. They got smoothed over. Someone would mention a delay. Another would say theirs arrived on time. The concern faded. Because early proof doesn't need to convince everyone. It only needs to quiet the room. And it worked. Each successful cycle made the next one easier to ignore. The brain stopped treating the money as exposed. It started treating it as parked. That shift mattered. Because once people believe something is already safe, they stop monitoring it like it's fragile. The paperwork reinforced that feeling. Clean formatting. Professional language. Nothing flashy. Nothing that begged for attention. Everything looked deliberate. And technically, much of it was true. Transactions existed. Accounts existed. Records existed. But here's the part that would matter later. Truth was being used selectively. The system showed results, not reasons. Outcomes, not mechanisms. That was enough. People don't usually ask how something works once it starts working for them. That's the foreshadowing. Because with every small success, the questions people should have asked felt less urgent. Why does this move so slowly? Why is everything so quiet? Why does it never change? Those questions drifted into the background. And in their place came something more dangerous: routine. Checks became less frequent. Updates got skimmed instead of read. Red flags lost their color. The proof didn't just validate the system. It trained people to stop looking for problems. And while nothing looked wrong on the outside, inside the structure, something was quietly hardening. The system wasn't growing because it was strong. It was growing because no one was testing it. That detail wouldn't seem important until much later, when the proof that once felt comforting became the reason nobody saw the collapse coming. Trust didn't appear all at once. It was assembled, piece by piece, until it felt automatic. Authority, the comfort of structure. The first layer of trust came from structure. Everything had a process. Forms, confirmations, timelines. Nothing felt improvised. Questions were answered with confidence, not speed. Responses sounded practiced, almost boring. The kind of tone that says, "This isn't our first time doing this." People trust systems that don't rush them. There were policies that looked official, procedures that implied oversight, language that felt compliant without ever explaining what it was compliant with. And because most people don't actually read fine print, the presence of it mattered more than the content. That's the first retention trigger: contradiction. The system didn't prove authority by explaining power. It proved it by looking like it didn't need to. As long as things kept moving on schedule, that illusion held. Media, visibility without attention. The second layer came from visibility. Not exposure. Not virality. Just presence. Mentions appeared in places people already trusted. Not glowing features. Not endorsements. Just references. A passing quote. A short blurb. A neutral description buried among other neutral descriptions. Nothing screamed promotion. And that was the trick. People assume scams beg for attention. This didn't. It showed up quietly, like it belonged there. Like it had always been part of the landscape. Search results didn't raise alarms. No warnings jumped out. No obvious red flags to trip over. And when people checked, because some did, they didn't find proof it was great. They found proof it existed. That was enough. Here's the second retention trigger: open loop. Because what mattered wasn't what the media said. It was what they didn't say. No criticism. No investigations. No urgency. Silence felt like approval. Influencers, relatability over reach. The third layer came from people who didn't look powerful at all. No celebrities. No big names. Just normal voices with small followings. People who sounded cautious. People who said things like, "I'm not telling anyone what to do, this is just what I'm doing." That phrasing mattered. It lowered defenses. Instead of sounding like sales, it sounded like transparency. Instead of promising results, it showed patience. Small wins. Quiet updates. No flexing. That relatability carried more weight than authority ever could. Because when someone who doesn't sound confident says something is working, it feels more honest. That's the third retention trigger, escalation. As more of these voices echoed the same calm message, the idea stopped feeling individual. It felt communal. And once something feels communal, people stop questioning it alone. Routine, the invisible reinforcement. Over time, trust stopped being built consciously. It became routine. People checked less, asked fewer questions, stopped comparing notes, not because they were convinced, but because they were comfortable. That's when the trust engine reached full speed. Authority made it feel structured. Media made it feel real. Influencers made it feel relatable. But routine made it feel safe. And safety is dangerous when it's assumed. Here's the fourth retention trigger, foreshadowing. Because the engine didn't need to convince people forever. It only needed to run long enough for trust to become habit. And habits don't ask questions. By the time the first real concern surfaced, not a delay, not a glitch, but a genuine pause, most people didn't react. They waited, because waiting had always worked before. What no one realized yet was that the same engine that built trust so quietly was now preventing anyone from seeing what was about to break it. At first, nothing felt like a decision. Money went in the same way subscriptions get renewed. Quietly. Automatically. Without that sharp moment where your brain says, pay attention. That was the first contradiction. People believed they were being careful. But careful choices usually feel heavy. This didn't. It felt light. Each step was small enough to ignore on its own. A deposit here. A confirmation there. Nothing big enough to trigger fear. And because nothing hurt, nothing felt risky. When doubts surfaced, they didn't arrive as alarms. They showed up as background noise. I should probably look into this more. I'll check later. Everything's been fine so far. That thinking didn't sound reckless. It sounded responsible. Here's the realization that quietly locked people in. Past success started standing in for future safety. Every smooth cycle rewrote the story in their head. This wasn't something new anymore. It was something proven. That's the second contradiction. The longer it ran, the less people felt the need to watch it. And then something subtle happened. People stopped thinking of the money as invested. They started thinking of it as already working. That shift mattered. Because when money is working, you don't disturb it. You don't poke it. You don't stress test it. You let it sit. When minor issues appeared, a delay, a vague update, a changed schedule, the brain reached for the easiest explanation. Systems lag. These things happen. This is normal. That explanation felt more reasonable than imagining everything was wrong. Here's another realization hook. The idea of being wrong felt worse than the idea of waiting. So people waited. And waiting kept reinforcing the system. Every time nothing bad happened after a delay, the delay stopped feeling like a warning. It started feeling like proof of patience paying off. That's the third contradiction. What should have triggered urgency created calm instead. People compared notes less often, not because they were hiding, but because they didn't feel the need. Why stir anxiety if everything's fine? That's when the internal math changed. The question stopped being, what's the worst that could happen? It became, why would I mess this up by reacting too fast? That logic felt mature, measured, smart. But it was built on an assumption no one had tested. That the system would always behave tomorrow, the way it behaved yesterday. Here's the realization that came too late for many. Consistency doesn't mean safety. It just means nothing has broken yet. And by the time that thought landed, really landed, it didn't create panic. It created hesitation. People didn't pull out. They paused. They watched. They waited for clarity. Because acting suddenly felt reckless. After being calm for so long. That's the final contradiction of this phase. The system trained people to distrust urgency. So when urgency finally mattered, it felt out of character. And while people were debating internally whether to act now or give it one more cycle, the situation outside their control was already moving in a direction they wouldn't understand until much later. At its peak, nothing felt fragile. Money moved on schedule. Balances looked healthy. Accounts felt settled. This was the phase where confidence stopped being cautious and started feeling earned. People didn't check out of fear anymore. They checked out of habit. The numbers had grown, not explosively, but steadily. Month after month, the totals crept upward. No spikes. No crashes. That slow curve became its own proof. Because in people's minds, volatility was danger. And this had none. The scale expanded quietly. What started as a handful of participants became thousands. Not through marketing blasts, but through casual mention. A recommendation at work. A comment at a family gathering. A private message that started with, "I usually wouldn't share this, but..." That phrasing mattered. It framed participation as restraint, not risk. Money pooled from all directions. Different states. Different incomes. Different reasons. Some people treated it like a parking spot. Others treated it like a backup plan. A few treated it like a long-term solution. But everyone shared one belief. This was under control. That belief showed up in behavior. Deposits increased slightly. Withdrawals became less frequent. People stopped testing the system. Why test something that's already proven itself? That was the contradiction at the center of the peak. The more stable it looked, the less anyone tried to stress it. Internally, the system felt unstoppable. Not because it was strong, but because nothing challenged it. Externally, there was no pressure. No complaints trending. No viral stories. No sudden scrutiny. It flew under every radar. That usually catches trouble. Regulators didn't rush in. Because nothing looked urgent. Banks didn't intervene. Because transactions were clean. Everything blended in. And from the outside, it didn't look like growth. It looked like maintenance. That's how the scale hid itself. Confidence hardened into assumption. People planned around it. Budgeted with it in mind. Delayed other decisions because this felt reliable. Some even stopped keeping close records. Why bother when nothing ever changed? That's when the peak locked in. The system wasn't just holding money. It was holding trust. And trust doesn't show up on statements. You only notice it when it's gone. Here's where the question starts to form. Quietly at first. If this involved so much money, so many people, so much time, why did no one step in? Why didn't someone slow it down? Why didn't anyone question the structure earlier? Why didn't any alarm get loud enough? The uncomfortable answer was already there. Because everything people are taught to fear, speed, pressure, chaos, was missing. What replaced it felt safe. And by the time anyone realized, that safety itself was the warning sign. The system was already too big, too quiet, and too trusted for anyone to stop it in time. The first crack didn't look like a break. It looked like a delay, a transfer that usually cleared in days, Took a little longer. Then another one did the same. No alerts. No explanations. Just waiting. At day 1, people told themselves it was nothing. Systems lag. Processing windows. Routine stuff. By day 3, a few started checking more often. Not panicking, just paying attention. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Updates sounded recycled. Polite. Vague. Still, nothing concrete to point to. At day 7, the tone shifted. People compared notes for the first time in months. Quietly. Carefully. Not everyone was affected, which made it harder to react. Some transfers still went through. Others didn't. That inconsistency slowed panic instead of accelerating it. Because if it were really broken, wouldn't it fail all at once? That was the contradiction that bought time. Inside the system, though, time was disappearing. By week 2, the language changed. Timelines became estimates. Estimates became promises. Promises became silence. The calm confidence that once felt reassuring now felt rehearsed. People sensed it before they understood it. Replies stopped addressing specific questions. Support stopped committing to dates. Everything pointed forward without saying how far. That's when waiting stopped feeling responsible and started feeling dangerous. At week 3, panic set in, but unevenly. Some people tried to pull everything out at once. Others froze, unsure if acting would make things worse. And that hesitation mattered. Because panic didn't erupt publicly. It fractured privately. While people debated what to do, the system stopped moving. Withdrawals stalled completely. Balances froze. No warning. No countdown. Just stillness. That's when the internal reality became impossible to hide. The cracks weren't technical. They were structural. Processes that had worked smoothly were suddenly exposed as placeholders. There was no backup plan. No contingency. No explanation that matched the scale of the problem. The countdown reached 0, without anyone announcing it. And in that moment, when nothing moved, nothing responded, and nothing made sense, people realized the worst part. The cracks had been there the whole time. They just hadn't mattered, until the system needed them not to exist. The collapse wasn't loud. It was abrupt. One day, accounts were visible. The next, they weren't. Dashboards failed to load. Access timed out. Login screens refreshed endlessly. No announcement. No explanation. Just absence. Communication stopped entirely. Messages went unread. Phones rang into nothing. What had once felt solid now felt hollow. Then the exposure began. Documents surfaced that didn't line up. Timelines contradicted each other. Records showed movement without purpose. Money had been circulating, not generating, not investing, just circulating. That detail changed everything. The structure wasn't paused. It was empty. Authorities moved in after the fact, not to stop it, but to document what was left. Accounts were flagged. Assets were frozen. What remained was locked down. By the time it was officially shut, there was nothing left to stabilize. No recovery phase. No gradual unwind. Just a hard stop. People refreshed pages that would never load again. Waited for updates that would never come. The system didn't fail slowly like the money had arrived. It ended all at once. And in that silence, the truth finally became unavoidable. Nothing had ever been building. After it ended, the damage didn't show up all at once. It showed up in second thoughts. Missed payments. Conversations people avoided having. For many, The loss wasn't just money. It was confidence. They didn't feel reckless. They felt fooled by something that never asked them to be reckless in the first place. And that's the lesson that still matters now. Today's risks don't always rush you. They don't shout. They don't promise the moon. They wait. They feel stable. They feel boring. They feel safe long enough for you to stop watching. Because modern scams don't break trust by asking for too much. They break it by asking for almost nothing, over and over, until questioning feels unnecessary. So the real warning isn't about fast money. It's about slow confidence. And if something in your life feels harmless, because nothing has gone wrong yet, that's exactly when you should be paying the most attention.